Dr. J's Movie Imaginarium. I'm here with the ever-entrusted and insightful Dr. Dan, the sidekick. How you doing, Dr. Dan?
I'm pretty good. It's snowing outside.
Yeah, it's getting a little chilly. We've got some snow coming. Halloween is just around the corner. We've done the horror genre. We're moving back into, and I feel like we're developing themes that are very connected here. We've got male protagonists who often stand alone from society, maybe morally weak in the noir genre. Male characters from this sort of patriarchal, often misogynistic perspective of the world, of a world that they don't seem to fit very well in. And why is the Hollywood movie industry crafting and creating all of these male characters, especially in the classic Hollywood cinema? There's so much to excavate in terms of film theory and film history. And we're going to do a little bit more today. We just heard a little bit of that terrific theme music from a Francis Ford Coppola movie, 1974, called The Conversation. This movie is a film in which a man, again, stands alone, stands aside. It begins with the sort of thickness of human interactions and experiences. The camera is high up, angled down at a crowd of people. The camera is emerging and getting closer and closer to the action. There are a number of conversations going on. There's a mime who's entertaining people. But very quickly, we realize that what is going on here is the listening in of a particular conversation, that there are a number of people here who are engaged in some kind of surveillance and eavesdropping of a conversation between a man and a woman, tracking the conversation, piecing together the various shards of audio pickups in various different places. This is all orchestrated by a man named Mr. Harry Call. Harry Call is a man with no phone in his home. He's a man with several keys to his door. He has no personal possessions of any worth or meaning, as he mentions in the movie. Mr. Call is also coded as extremely unfashionable. He wears like this flimsy, weird polyester raincoat. He's wearing out-of-date glasses. He's dressed in a skinny sort of madman 1950s tie. And he's walking around 1974 San Francisco. That first opening shot is in Union Square in downtown San Francisco, where a number of really excellent movies. Hitchcock's The Birds begins in Union Square. Jimmy Stewart in Hitchcock's Vertigo walks across Union Square. So this film begins in Union Square with Mr. Call, who is, what would you call him, a private investigator who is a sound expert, I suppose.
Yeah, he's a privately contracted surveillance expert.
Yeah, a surveillance expert who his personal life is really interesting. And I want to begin here in thinking about that. I mean, here's a guy who very much is awkward in society. I was reading a little bit about this film, and the main actor, Gene Hackman, who's, I think, maybe one of his best performances of all time. Gene Hackman had a really hard time with this role because it's the exact opposite of him. Gene Hackman is a very energetic, extrovert, outgoing dude, and the character he's playing, Mr. Call, in the conversation is supremely awkward and doesn't have any close friends. He has a romantic relationship with a woman played by Terry Garr, a very early picture for Terry Garr. I think this is just before Young Frankenstein, or maybe the year of Young Frankenstein. And he visits her in her apartment after the opening sequence in which they're listening to this conversation. He indeed goes down to meet this woman. She knows nothing about him. She doesn't know his birthday. She doesn't know where he lives. She doesn't know what he does for a living. She knows nothing. He's this mysterious stranger who comes in and makes love to her and has romantic relationships with her. In fact, he pays her rent, right? But then just leaves as quickly as he arrives. And so he is this shadow man in a way, very awkwardly set against what is San Francisco in 1974. San Francisco not quite in the throes of the counterculture moment as it was in 67 and 68 and 69, but 1974 is still, a happening, fashionista center of the world kind of place with all these interesting and lively characters. And here's this sort of almost grayscale text, this film, with a grayscale character who is something of an enigma. There's not much said in this film. There's no narration, for example. There's not a lot of thickness to the conversation. And here, I think it's a tremendous irony because the movie is about a conversation, and the movie is about sound. And the sonic realm really drives the visual elements. What you ultimately see in the movie, I think, is largely determined by the sounds that various different people are, in fact, paid to construct and to analyze. And I think that's a nice touch. But it's an awkward place, is it not? San Francisco, 1974, for such a movie as The Conversation?
Yeah, somewhat. I think also you could say that he, because of his blandness, out of date, no narration, unlike Chinatown, I think The Conversation is a film noir updated without trying too hard to be self-conscious about it being film noir. So it's going to use color, but I think Coppola's sort of trick is the use of sound, maybe perhaps rather than the shades of black and white, to create the mystique. But yeah, I think it's the sounds. I think the one thing that you always hear is you. How many times do you hear the conversation throughout the movie? And
yeah,
so,
you hear it multiple times again and again in different parts and different elements. It's really, it is. I don't think there's ever a complete iteration of from beginning to end the conversation though that we hear. It's always little bits and pieces. It's always little pieces of the puzzle, but never put together in its entirety.
Yeah,
I can think of movies that wonderfully play on the pieces of knowledge that we have, and then sometimes bring it back around to give us the full and complete iteration of it pieced together. I can also think of movies that don't do that. I think like Kurosawa's Rashomon. I had been thinking about it because we went and saw The Joker yesterday, and I thought there were some interesting things related to Rashomon. Rashomon, that great Japanese film in which there are all these differing perspectives on this rape. There's never a definitive story. No one ever really knows what happens, and it's kind of left there for the audience to piece together in the ruins. And there's certainly that element to this film. Although I think there is an explicit drive to the narrative, which is that when you watch this film, you realize that Mr. Call is being hired by these kind of shadowy corporate figures to follow around this couple and to nail down exactly what was said in Union Square during this conversation. And some of the phrases in this conversation, he'd kill us if he got the chance, right? And she says, what about me? At one point, they start talking about a homeless man sleeping on the bench, right? And she says, oh, that's so sad. Think about it. That man has a mother, and et cetera, et cetera. So they're listening on this conversation. He's been being paid $15,000, I think, for just this recording of the conversation. And the individual, you get the, I think it's clearly obvious from watching it for the first time, you get the sense that these two are engaged in an extramarital affair. And the director, I think is who he's called, the director, the figure who is paying for this, is the scorned husband. That's a classic noir setup. You mentioned noir. There are classic noir touches throughout this film. Intrigue, detective play, criminal behavior that's obscured and not very well understood. A male protagonist who has romantic liaisons, but in a very casual, almost like stranger to stranger type way with the Terry Garr character.
Would you think, one thing is she a more intimate prostitute? Or is that like a girlfriend, boyfriend? Like, I didn't understand when I've seen it a couple times, but I'm still puzzled at that relationship because it seems like it's based on a mutual appreciation for each other, at least romantically, but there seems to be a monetary, element to it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd have to read into it. But
I think it's
nuanced.
It's very nuanced, and it's left open, of course. I don't think that there's any, no matter how many times you watch this movie, you're going to be able to determine the exact nature of the relationship.
Yeah, and it's almost, he can't afford to have an actual relationship because that will involve divulging information upon which he,
he's a fortress.
Yeah.
And I think that it works well in the film, in the story, because it signifies and it symbolizes the way in which he stands alone and the way in which human beings really do not penetrate this man's life in any respect whatsoever. And that brings me to, I think, one of the important central elements of the conversation, which is here is this kind of, okay, he's got no phone in his home. He has all these keys to all these locks on his door. He owns no personal possessions except for maybe a saxophone, right? It is, in a sense, the privilege of privacy is super paramount to his identity. The privilege of privacy. A man who can see all, but above all, hear all, right? But who cannot be seen or heard. A man who can hear, but cannot be heard. In a sense, this is this tension that I discussed with regards to the Truman Show. That Truman Show with Jim Carrey as a central figure, who is this genuine thing in a made-up reality television world. There is a tension in the movie of watching that movie between scopophilia, which is a pleasure in looking, and scopophobia, which is the fear of being looked at and surveilled, right? And there, I think Mr. Call has that tension. Clearly, he is in such a privileged position of being the bug in the wall, right? Of listening in on the conversation and being an expert on the kind of technological means with which to do that. But he's also like almost obsessively and paranoid about his own privacy. Not a single person can get near him at all. I got the sense watching it this time, this is maybe the 5th time I've seen The Conversation, I kind of got the idea watching it this time that there's a much more practical reason for that, which is that he needs to keep his, protect his sources and protect his material, sort of akin to like in his workshop, he's got that caged area where all the sensitive stuff is. Like that's the way he treats his private life, you know, in order to do his job well, he's got to be extremely...
He's internalized it.
Yeah, he's internalized all this sort of like privacy, strict fortress-like privacy. But that's the first time I ever had that idea. Every time previous to in watching this movie, The Conversation, I always had a feeling that it was much more of a personal paranoia, and it was more of a character flaw or idiosyncrasy, as opposed to something that was like practically, designed for his work and profession.
And that makes sense with is she a prostitute or not? To him, that's the most efficient way he can have romantic relations is through sort of an agreement based on a transaction, the same way that he has a transaction with the $15,000 for the surveillance tape of,
Yeah, and it fits actually with the conversation he has with that woman who ends up being a subversive character and steals the tapes, right? But that night, that drunken evening, he has a conversation with that woman. And
he finally divulges,
He says something like, how do you tell a woman that you love her when you can't say that you love her? Or some weird thing like that. And she kind of laughs at him like, that doesn't even make any sense. That's an indication, I think, that we're onto something here, that this is more of a practical consideration of his craft and the needs of his craft.
And he got burned.
Yeah. He got burned. The moment he divulged, not even to that woman, Terry Garr, but to another woman, that he and that was the night in which he gets burned.
It's funny too, like if you think, so working through that aesthetic, it's interesting because that 70s moment, right? So for the kind of faltering masculinity in the 70s, there's so many times when he's listening to what was it again, that the homeless man on the bench, and was it Cindy Williams? Her character's talking about this, and what he has a mother, and you're always looking at Harry. So it's, in a way, she is talking about him.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So he is the one that's on the bench, basically almost dead. And so, I think there's a weird nostalgia at play. Like, remember 1974, 73 is American Graffiti. And I think 74 is the first episode of Happy Days. And so the 70s is going into this nostalgia. But The Conversation has a more nuanced version of it where you might not be on the surface, but there's this undertone of he is out of time. He has hit a space in his life where he can't afford intimacy because of his job. And so...
Wouldn't it be great to see Mr. Call in an episode of Happy Days?
Yeah.
Fashion, in terms of fashion, he'd fit right in. He could just be the neighbor guy. And that'd be an interesting sort of drifting through the sun-drenched, light-drenched sort of nostalgic view.
Yeah.
And you're right. The Conversation television carries on these kinds of nostalgias in the 1970s, but in terms of American cinema in the 1970s, this is what's been called a renaissance of American cinema, a revolution in pictures. Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, a book by Peter Biskin, talks a lot in detail about this sort of moment of excessive, crazy, out of control, drug-fueled decade in which so many brilliant films are made. But these brilliant films have a real edge to them in direct response to the classic Hollywood era, which begins crumbling. I mean, it's impossible to figure out exactly when it begins crumbling, because even 1950, we talked about Sunset Boulevard. 1950 is kind of a nostalgic look at the silent era, and by 1950, Hollywood was already becoming a ghost town, and it was becoming like sort of a place of a creative graveyard, if you will, where ideas went to die, and CinemaScope and biblical epics could do nothing to save the slow burn and slow death of Hollywood. And by the 1960s, especially, you have films like Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal comes to the United States of America in the mid-1950s and does tremendously well. Kurosawa's Japanese samurai epics come to the United States in the 1950s and do tremendously well. You've got Fellini and the rise of the post-Italian neo-realists in the 1960s, Antonioni and Fellini, and their movies do tremendously well. And American audiences are striving for European films that are actually saying something meaningful, that are deeply imbued with either philosophical musings and insights or a kind of existentialism that so dominated that period of time.
And there's that shift too, is you can't see realism in the theater. You see it at home when you watch Vietnam every night on the news or demonstrations. And so there's this disconnect between, what was the movie with Clint Eastwood singing with Lee Marvin? It was the Western musical. I think it was in the late '60s.
Oh yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah,
but it's just kind of these ridiculous musicals that are over, too expensive.
Like Dr. Dolittle.
Yeah, and it doesn't. And then right when you think of some of the other movies like Bonnie and Clyde and then The Graduate, where it's kind of more of a stark. Realism.
Visceral realism.
Because you're watching realism on TV too, and it just somehow the film and something happens because of what's happening outside someone's door.
Yeah, and I think the go into the fine grain of the history just a little bit. The code breaks down first, and the breakdown of the code really does spur on a lot of the corporate rearrangements, the end of the Mogul era. Most of the Moguls have died off. Very few of them are still alive by the mid-1960s.
And that's when the multinationals start picking up. So it's, again, it's globalization. You have multinationals, like Gulf and Western.
Yes, Gulf
It's
Western.
a copper company.
Yeah. Kinney Company is like a parking lot conglomerate from Las Vegas. They buy out Warner Brothers. Gulf Western buys out Paramount. It's no longer the moguls at the top who determine things. It's shareholders, corporate shareholders, who are looking at profits and the bottom line of things. Classic Hollywood studios like Paramount and Warner Brothers and MGM become fully consolidated into multinational corporations and their corporate edifice. And interestingly enough, and I could talk in some detail about, for example, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. That was a movie that the production code said basically you need to cut out all these cuss words, and they didn't. They just ignored the directive from the production code, and that was the first time that a major studio basically ignored production code dictates.
So they took the step,
and then that was it just all fell apart after that. It realized it was a house of cards. And then you have these revolutionary pictures that come out, and there's a great book by Mark Harris called Pictures That Are Revolutionary. It discusses the 5 Best Picture nominees of the 1968 Academy Awards, all the movies from 1967 that were nominated for Best Picture. And that is Dr. Dolittle, which lost millions of dollars with Rex Harrison and was only upheld by MGM because that was the old way of doing things, that every studio got a movie that they could have nominated for Best Picture. It's a crap picture. It still is. There's very little value in it, but it was a symbol of the old Hollywood frantically searching for some kind of theatrical, crazy madness to hold the thing together. So it was Dr. Dolittle, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, directed by Stanley Donen. And Donen, who is this bleeding heart liberal in Hollywood, really wanted to bring a liberal message to America. He genuinely thought that Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where Sidney Poitier, a black doctor, marries a white woman, or is going to, and she brings him back home to her parents, who are of the old world and the old way of doing things. Donen thought that this movie would shock the conscience of America and would be very controversial, but it ended up not being. Most of the youth of America were like, whatever. And in fact, it was like the older generation were like, that was a good picture. That was a good...
Yeah, it was satisfying.
Yeah, that was a picture that had a good lesson to it. So Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And then In the Heat of the Night, which I think lays the foundation, we talked about briefly, lays the foundation for the modern crime drama, and is still a very well done movie. That's the one that actually wins. But the two movies that were on the outside, they really are the visions of the future of American cinema. Neither of them win that year Best Picture, but both of them are much more memorable than any of those other three. And that is Bonnie and Clyde with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, and The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman. And just very briefly, I wanted to mention something about The Graduate. That text, that's an interesting film text because the ennui loneliness and Sartre existentialism of the Dustin Hoffman character actually has a venerable tradition in American film of, again, a man who stands aside society, and society does not understand this man very well. Yeah. A white man of various privileges who can stand askew from the world and look at it from an interesting and unusual perspective. But crucially, the audience, we watching the movie, we're right there with him in that intimate setting. We stand askew from society as well, right? We're bound to that male protagonist and his vision of the world. And those are classic tropes that go through Hitchcock, go through the 1930s Hollywood cinema, through the silent era. It's just updated into a countercultural form before it takes off in these 70s films that we're talking about today. So an interesting moment, 1967. And then, the corporate mergers take place, and the industry is completely retooled and reconfigured.
Yeah, and that's how Evans comes in, because they don't know how to make films. They know that these young people are making movies that sell. So Easy Rider sells. So they must know what they're doing. And it's almost like they just got rid of middle management and pulled up the young people to start making movies. And you have that freedom. I guess some people say it's 67 to 77. Like Star Wars ruins it, right? But you have, for that brief 10 years, a bunch of movies that come out that, like The Conversation. Mm-hmm. Well, didn't Travolta make a movie? But it was a video.
Blowout, yeah.
Yeah.
From 1981, Blowout.
Yeah, that was on the theater.
It was in the Joker. Yeah, it was reference to the Joker. The Joker we just saw yesterday, and we'll talk about it next week. The Joker is set in 1981, and Blowout is showing at a movie theater in that film. That's actually a very terrific film, and one that we could talk about at a later date. But a special effects guy who catches an assassination in video and in sound, and pieces it together. Both of those films are inspired by a European art house movie, Michelangelo Antonioni, Blow Up. Right? Blow Up with David Hemmings is a movie I love to hate. It is a tremendous film. It is very exacerbating in its sort of European avant-garde sensibilities, and its sort of like coyishness of always flaunting, toying with meaning, and really like obscuring as much as it reveals again and again and again. It's a movie that is very much, I think, at the heart of what the cinema does, which is, this is a theory from Christian Metz, the imaginary signifier, a film theory that argues that movies they're not signifying what you see on the screen. They're signifying the absence of what you see on the screen. So when you see Harry Caul, with headphones on, listening intently to a conversation with all this sound equipment, you're not seeing Harry Caul, you're not seeing Gene Hackman, you're not seeing the sound equipment, you're seeing the absence of it. That's what's signifying here, is the absence. It's not in that movie theater right there with you in 1974 when you watched that movie. It's not in your bedroom last weekend when you watched it off of Amazon Prime, right? It's signifying the absence of that thing. And so cinema is always the signification of absence, right? It's always calling attention to what is not there. And Blow Up with Antonioni is all about that. At the end of the movie, you realize that he probably didn't even see a dead body to begin with. Like, there's nothing there. There's no there. Just like the tennis rackets and the tennis ball that the mimes are playing at the end of the movie. There's no tennis racket. There's no tennis ball. The movie is about the signification of the absence in the cinema. And so I love it. And it's also a movie that It inspired Coppola's The Conversation. Coppola wanted to make a movie that directly dealt with that material. Just to briefly throw out there, Antonioni's Blow Up. David Hemmings is this mod fashion photographer who lives in the poor working class district in London, and in fact dresses as a working class individual and goes to the factory to take pictures, very real and stark and artistic pictures of factory post-industrial life, and then goes back to his studio and takes photographs of models who he calls them animals. I think he calls them cows, though. At one point, he's very, very denigrating to these women who are just sort of objects to be lined up for his shots. So he's this very he's the original hipster in so many ways. He is taking pictures in a park and he's this suspicious people. A woman named Vanessa, played by Vanessa Redgrave, comes up to him and asks him for the camera roll. He doesn't give it to her. He goes back to his studio. He starts blowing up the image. He lines up the vectors where they're looking. Vanessa Redgrave and the older man are looking in the bushes off to the side. He follows the vectors and the sight lines to an area in the bushes. He blows it up. He sees legs sticking out of the bushes. He goes back there that night. He sees a dead man. So he's uncovered a murder with his, little dalliances in photography as this artist. And so that's the basic premise of the film. The Conversation takes on very much similar substance in the sense that Mr. Call, he's an expert in sound. He's been hired. He doesn't know what this conversation's about. He doesn't know anything about it. He's just being paid to pick up a conversation. And in doing so, he gets thrown into the world of criminal intrigue and murder.
Yeah. Did you think remember as they're walking around and she says, "Laugh like I just told you a joke"?
That it was all a setup?
Yeah. Do you think that they knew they were being surveilled by the old man? That had to have been. Yeah. And then that's why he said okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's my take anyway. Yeah, so, I mean, it's hard. I was having this conversation recently, and we just got done watching The Joker, and we'll talk more about the ways in which movies always have this radical instability of everything being a dream, everything being a delusion. Every single movie has that instability somewhere or another. It's this deep, it's the nothing, to take a concept from the Never-Ending Story. It's this weird existential void that is inside every movie, which is that you never know that what you're seeing is a delusion or a dream or some constructed reality within the diegetic world or whatever it might be. But my take of The Conversation is that this is all a setup, and they know they're being surveilled, and they are hopefully potentially implicating Mr. Call. That's the only thing that I can get out of this, or encouraging the director, who is the ultimate murder victim, encouraging to come to the hotel room, the site of the murder, by using the tapes as the draw, right, as the hook to bring him in. So yeah, that's my take about that. When you talk about the privilege of privacy, this fear, both a desire to listen and to have the privileged position from which to be the fly on the wall and to listen to a conversation, but also the fear of being listened to and to be heard and to be seen, I think this strikes at the paradox of the liberal man in contemporary society, Dr. Dan. The liberal man in contemporary society, a desire to hear all, a fear of being heard, a desire to stand above and stand separated in a place in which they can take in everything, but a place that does not leave them vulnerable or exposed to being looked at. And as we carry on, I want us to think about this sort of liberal man in contemporary society and what might this mean. Does this ultimately fit, and how do we see this through these movies in the 1970s? I'll add here, though, that the cinema, classic cinema, and what we call the cinematic apparatus, which is not just the film text, but it's the projector, it's the seats, it's the auditorium, it's the whole movie watching experience. The movie watching experience of the classic cinema is a perfect medium through which to investigate this scopophilia, because we as moviegoers, we pay a ticket, we go into a darkened room, we're literally looking through a keyhole into private people's lives, sometimes extremely private things. and we're given this privileged view into their lives, and they can't see us. We're in the dark. We got like popcorn, like we could, we're in the dark with a bunch of strangers, which itself is pretty interesting.
But you're in on the surveillance.
You're in on it all.
Yeah.
You see it all, and there is a surveillance like. And this has long been discussed and talked about, like with the literature around Hitchcock's Rear Window, right? Jimmy Stewart broke his leg. He's looking at all these apartments across the way. He is himself a kind of metaphor for the movie watcher, and he gets to watch all these movies play out on the other side of the apartment building, right? Mm-hmm. It calls attention to the cinematic apparatus being one of scopophilia and of surveillance and of watching from a privileged position in which your position can't be exposed.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the idea of it's really about control. Mm-hmm. And if film comes about in the 1890s and then takes off in the early teens, the height of imperialism, right? 1900, people of European descent controlled 85 to 90% of the globe. Mm. And I always feel like the aftermath of decolonization and civil rights in this country has always been the fear of what if they, in quotes, do everything that people of European descent had done to them for 500 years.
Yeah.
And so there's this always, it feels like that crucial ontological undertone of these 70s movies is this fear of the formerly historically marginalized people striking back, whether it's, the looks in Taxi Driver. I love, I think a lot has been written on like the anti-blackness of Scorsese films, mm-hmm. but as I was watching it, if that is there or not, it still represents Scorsese as a director needing to channel these sentiments, which are very American. Like Travis Bickle has very American anti-black attitudes and suspicions and paranoia. Like he is of his country.
Yeah.
And he's in a moment where within Taxi Driver, women and people of color are empowered. They're not deferring, right? I think that's critical in these movies. French Connection.
Yeah.
Remember, there's that discussion between the two cops about trusting, and it's sort of to me. And then the Dirty Harry movies, right? You have to play dirty as they did during imperialism and settler colonialism and all those sorts of things. You still have to do that to keep sort of the quote savages at bay. Yeah. And to me, like that's a huge part of that, that militant masculinity that you see in a lot of the movies and that.
Yeah, you covered a lot just there. I mean, and going back to Taxi Driver, the visceral racism of Travis Bickle's character is a great example of how you can be explicit without being articulating, or visceral and powerful without explicitly articulating, I think is what I want to say.
And just those shots.
Yes. I mean, the death stare that he gives various different black figures who walk in and out of the frame or in front of him, et cetera, is powerful and is something that I think maybe on first viewing you might not pick up on how powerful that of a motivating factor that is for the protagonist. But the more you watch it, the more you realize
it's not a glimpse.
Yeah.
It's a few seconds.
Yeah. And it's belabored. I have read about this, and I think I've verified this, that Paul Schrader, who wrote the script for Taxi Driver in such a short period of time, originally intended that the pimp would be played by a black man. But as they were nearing shooting, Scorsese decided to go with Harvey Keitel and switch up the character to a white man. And part of his motivating reasoning, from what I understand, is both that Harvey Keitel was a great actor he wanted to have in the movie, but it was also that he did not want to, A, make it too explicit, and then B, make it too controversial. Yeah. He wanted that deep-seated visceral racism to remain just below the surface, and had the pimp character, I forget his name in that movie, I can't remember his name. It's something like Angel or whatever it is, that Harvey Keitel plays, that if it had been a black man, then it would have not been just underneath the surface. It would have exploded up over the top, which is, And so you mentioned also Dirty Harry. here's a big difference from the movie we're talking about in some detail, the conversation, and Taxi Driver, which is where I want to go eventually. The conversation is set in San Francisco, and Taxi Driver is set in the urban decay of New York. And I think that there's an interesting difference there. But to go back a little bit to 1971 in the original Dirty Harry, right, directed by Don Siegel, starring Clint Eastwood. This is, Clint Eastwood came up through the Westerns. And you mentioned that movie that Eastwood did that was kind of a hybrid that pushed him over into that territory of being a detective and a cop.
1968.
It comes a little bit before that.
Coogan's Bluff.
Yeah, Coogan's Bluff. And then he directs his own picture, Clint Eastwood, called Play Misty for Me. And that's a really underrated picture because that movie, from my reading, is all about Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood's always toying with misogynistic violence and racism, and is always enacting it, and then in interviews being like, there's none of that in there. This is the game he's played for like 40 years, like, hey, Dirty Harry is not fascist. Play Misty for Me is not a justification of, physical abuse I get directed at women, but that's all that movie is. I mean, he plays a radio personality who hooks up with this woman who becomes totally obsessively crazy, like, Hitchcock sort of like psycho femme fatale, and the whole picture is moving up to the point when he finally just punches her in the face and kills her, which is, spoiler alert, what happens. But it's a deeply upsetting movie, and it's a movie that marks the beginning of Clint Eastwood's sort of auteur articulations of masculinity in this moment of the fear of loss of control, in this moment of the decay of urban America and the decay of certain traditional values and trust in the media, trust in political institutions.
And it's the first decade in the history of the United States when white men, especially white men with property, are forced to compete legislatively with women and people of color. So it's that, to me, again, we go through all these 70s movies for the faltering masculinity. That's such an there's this loss of entitlement that had been in place for over 300 years. So it's a very existential, and think of the sheer amount of male directors versus women directors of the era.
Yeah.
It's just, the only one, Stephanie Rothman, I think she did, she was making, the only reason why I know her is because I've studied like the exploitation films, and she was key in, as a director in those. But it
was a very masculine, angry kind of decade in terms of American film.
Yeah, young men making movies.
Yeah, and Harry Callahan, Clint Eastwood's detective character in Dirty Harry, is at the early end of that, 1971. It was at the beginning of that, 1971, and his rage is against the legal establishment, the judicial establishment, the courts, law, the Supreme Court, but also the counterculture.
Yeah.
There is this visceral anger of the counterculture. I mean, look at the Scorpio serial killer in Dirty Harry. He's got frizzy hippie hair. He's got a peace sign belt buckle that's skewed to the side. It's like, peace has been skewed by like horrors of the counterculture.
He's maniacal.
Yeah, yeah, and sort of clownish. But he also targets like he targets like clearly coded as queer black men in Haight-Ashbury.
Yeah.
And in was he in the? No, I think it's in Haight-Ashbury, and then there's another sequence in the Mission District. There's none in Castro, but there he clearly is targeting, and he's got like the sniper, crosshairs on various different coded identities that are ones that are clearly visible in a counterculture San Francisco environment. So he's sort of like this devious, murderous, gesture-like character who's killing the very people out of the movement from which he emerges.
Yes,
so sees the movie from Harry Callahan's
He's
perspective.
the Manson, right?
Yeah,
He's
exactly.
He's the Manson element of the counterculture.
Yeah, because Manson was very unfortunately considered a guru by some, and had all of these sort of connections to the counterculture at the time.
It's funny you say like the sort of the enemies of Eastwood in these films, because remember his partner's Latino
guy from San Jose State,
and he gets injured.
Yes,
he doesn't get killed, but he's injured.
Yeah.
Second movie, African American man.
Yeah.
Who I think he gets injured.
Yeah.
The third one, it's Cagney and Lacey. I can't remember her name, but she is in Cagney and Lacey in the 80s. she's his partner, and she is killed.
Wow.
So it's like you have this weird gauntlet of historically marginalized identities who cannot quite keep up with Eastwood and are either injured, or in the case of women in the police force, she literally jumps in front of the shotgun blast from a bad guy and saves Callahan from being killed.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so, it's not even subtextual. It's so right up there on the surface of things, and I think it's where a lot of the energy and drive and the interest I saw Dirty Harry, the original 1971, at the Castro Theater in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. So local San Francisco audience, they ate that movie up. I mean, this majority, I imagine, in the audience are pretty progressively liberal watching this.
It becomes camp. I would watch it again. Like, it's just.
Yeah, I mean, they ate it up in the sense of, they didn't cheer on Dirty Harry Callahan in some genuine way. They just laughed the entire time. I mean, there are a lot of, camp elements to its fascistic sort of like development of its story. And it's a weird movie in a weird moment. It makes quite a bit of money. It is what I mean by weird is that a lot of the story of Dirty Harry and then the subsequent Dirty Harry franchise, pretty conventional fare. Mm-hmm. It's not as though the story is doing anything revolutionary in a truly revolutionary era of American cinema, but it's the codes and it's the identities and it's this latent force of masculine violence that's going to explode out in much more explicit ways.
Yeah, and I think the end of the code too plays into that. Like I always thought that, the code is undone at the same time women gain social equality essentially, and people of color. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of like the moment that, and then we put this in the language of neoliberalism, Hollywood literally is deregulated. Mm-hmm. Right. And so now you have quantitative analysis ratings, which now judge what the movie is. But at the same time, the freedom that's allowed through the dismantling of the code, now it's open season on violence against women, mm-hmm. or just violence in general. So it's sort of, there's a level of freedom that comes with it, but the freedom is sort of on the side of lonely males seeking an identity in a world that can no longer be based off their ability to subjugate others, mm-hmm. right? And in Clint Eastwood, I think especially his movies, especially what's the Western, High Plains Drifter,
mm-hmm.
right,
and Outlaws, Josie Wales, and so you go back to the conversation. There's some elements of this, but it's not as, especially violence against women, is not as explicit. In fact, that's what drives the illusion that we think that she is going to be murdered. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Call, thinks that all the way up until the moment toward the end of the movie when he's trying to save her in the limousine. And he realizes that he witnessed something that he thought was her murder, but it actually becomes the murder of Robert Duvall, who plays the director, right?
And it turns out, I mean, here's another sort of, we don't know how it plays out. Was Harrison Ford, aka Han Solo, in the conversation? Was he in on the coup?
Yeah, I think so. I get some explicit reference that I think his name is called Mr. Stett or something in the film.
Yeah, he's so good.
And he clearly is involved, and he clearly is implicated. He's clearly, this is a weird moment in the film. So, but before I get to, can I briefly mention a couple other things? So Mr. Call, he's an outsider in the sense that he's coded as anachronistic to the time. He doesn't look like he's in 1974 San Francisco. He stands alone. He's this intensely private individual, but yet he listens to everyone's conversations. There's also explicit references to him being very religious. He's very Catholic, right? Yeah. At one point he says, "Don't use the name in vain. It bothers me," right? He doesn't like it when people, use the Lord's name in vain. He goes to confession. So he's this very outside the box kind of identity in counterculture San Francisco in 1974. He does a job. He's unsure of the meaning. He sets the date to turn in the, and John Cazale is in the film as well and does such a good job. One of the great character actors in the 1970s. So now he makes a meeting to give up the tapes and get paid, right? And here's where Harrison Ford comes in, Mr. Stett. He goes to the corporate headquarters and he says, I need to see the director. And Harrison Ford's like, well, the director's not here. He instructed me to take the tapes and give you the money. This is a weird moment. What the hell is Mr. Call doing? Why does he decide to take the tapes back and refuse the money? I don't get it. I mean, I watched it actually 3 or 4 times. I just rewound and watched the scene again a couple of times last weekend because I was trying to pick up on some kind of subtlety or visual cue, but there's really nothing there. I get the sense from Gene Hackman's terrific acting and his physical acting that he's uncomfortable with the arrangement and he's suspicious of something. But what leads to his suspicions?
Well, remember, he had back in '68, he had the job from New York that led to someone getting killed. And that's what the expert in New York.
Yes, that's right.
He brings that up and he's egging him on about, what'd you do? How'd you do it? Mm-hmm. And so I think that comes a little later. Yeah, right, once he's listening to the tape and gets it set, he has suspicions, and then by the time he gets there, he's paranoid.
Okay.
And so I think that's probably the main.
I can see that. Thank you for explaining it to me. So, because I think, when she says something like he'd kill us if he got the chance. Mm-hmm. So those are the lines that are making him very trepidatious and concerned about getting involved in a job that's going to lead to the death of somebody again. I still, though, it's like the moment Harrison Ford's like, the director's not here. He instructed me to give you the money and I will take the tapes. Like almost immediately, Gene Hackman kind of like is influenced by Harrison Ford saying that in a weird way. But at any rate, he takes the tapes back. Harrison Ford grabs them and starts pulling them in the other direction. We have some tense close-ups. Harrison Ford says, now look, don't get involved, Mr. Call. These tapes are dangerous. Someone may get hurt. Right. And that also weird wrinkle, right? Because if it's that he is suspicious there's going to be a murder, he's going to be implicated in the death of somebody, and that's why he takes the tapes back. Mr. Stett, played by Harrison Ford, is explicitly telling him that not giving him the tapes is going to get somebody hurt. So it seems like he's in a rock and a hard place here. It doesn't matter what he does. He's now involved in something that is, as Harrison Ford says, these tapes are dangerous, right?
Yeah.
So what compels Call to take back these tapes? It's interesting. And as he leaves, he then sees the female target in the elevator. He stands alone with her. He's extremely awkward, always kind of pushing up his glasses and sort of looking down and looking up at her. And I got certainly a sense, again, there's no voiceover narration. It's not a noir movie. There's not like thick description of what we see, which I think makes it very different in textual resonance to Taxi Driver, as we'll talk about here in a moment. But I get the sense when he's looking at her in the elevator that he sees a woman who's about to be murdered, that he sees a potential victim of a grisly crime, and that he is now wrapped up in it somehow, and he's going to do something to stop this. He goes back. He reviews the tapes. In this movie, the conversation, visuality always follows the sonic realm. It's like the sound is really driving what we see and determines the structure of the film itself. And I think that's a really, really excellent touch, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's at one point, Mr. Call says, I don't know anything about human nature. I don't know anything about curiosity, right? He is in some ways a black box. Now, again, this could be the quirkiness and weirdness of his personality, or it could be he's consciously doing this because the profession that he's in requires him to not know anything about human nature, as he says. Mm-hmm. So he's the opposite of a philosopher. He doesn't know anything about curiosity. So he has no intrigue and inquiry. Now, we know this is not the case because that's actually why he takes the tapes back. And he's reviewing these tapes again and again. Well, I mean, maybe not. I guess there's two potential interpretations to that. On the one hand, it could be he's genuinely curious. On the other hand, though, it could be that he is just very practically trying to avoid what happened in 1968.
Yeah.
So again, it maybe fits more with this kind of grounded, what we see in Mr. Call is somebody who has been shaped almost all the way down by the profession he's in, which requires an absolute level of secrecy and an absolute expertise in surveillance, that it has informed who this guy is and
Yeah.
how he operates.
And think about the times when he opens up. I think he opens up a little bit at the conference, and then the party back at his office.
and it comes
you
back to bite him.
briefly, yeah, you not just that, but when he's talking to the fellas,
Yeah,
he briefly becomes good-going Gene Hackman.
yeah,
And I think those are it's almost as if to do his job, he has to have that aesthetic, but sometimes the aesthetic gets overrun by this need for connection.
yes.
And he gets excited, right?
Yeah, and that whole sequence is, of course, soured by the fact that one of these competitors on the East bugged him and has a bug in the pen that he gave him, right? And that makes him extremely upset, even though what he had said, it is actually the repeat of the conversation he has with the woman in the parking lot, where he says something about, how do you tell a woman that you love her if you can't tell her that you love her, or something like that. And the other, his competitor, is actually listening in on he's been bugged with the pen, and this makes Mr. Call extremely angry and upset. Even though there's nothing necessarily incriminating at all. It was just a joke, right? The guy was just a buddy. He's just joking with him, and he's saying, look at this great toy that I've invented, a listening device and a pen, right? But what makes Mr. Call upset is the penetration of this absolute level of secrecy. It is an undermining of his very identity.
Yeah. And it comes at the moment of him getting up the courage to open up. So it's almost he gets burned twice. He gets burned by his competitor who plays the tape, and then he gets burned when she, in the middle of the night, takes the tapes.
Yes, and he wakes up and he says, the bitch, and stole the tapes. I make mention of that because although there's not much explicit sort of like women hating and misogyny going on in this text, at least from Mr. Call's perspective, there are little threads of it here and there. Like that this Derek Carr, he's in a romantic relationship with a woman that he completely takes out of his life. She knows nothing about him. And for whatever reason why a man would think that would be okay and a reasonable and normal and healthy relationship with another human being is quite odd. And then there's this mention, of course, that, and this is classic noir, that woman, I don't even think she has a name in the film. She becomes a kind of like low level femme fatale, right?
Yeah.
That she burns the male protagonist.
Yeah.
And then he gets to say something nasty about her. He says at one point toward the end, so there's a dream sequence in the film, actually. He falls asleep while she's stealing the tapes. And there's a dream sequence that has obscured visual audio, and it's almost like the dream is like his mind is in one of his recording devices, and he's getting all these weird conflicting feedback loops and different patches of sound and visual images. It's a terrific sequence in the film, and there are sort of visions of murder that happen. And in the sequence, he says something like, I'm not afraid of death, I'm afraid of murder. Right? I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of murder. It's a great film. It barrels toward, of course, this ending in which Mr. Call goes to the hotel. He hears the name of the hotel in the conversation. This, I think, is the evidence that suggests that this was all a setup, and what they were doing was saying that name of the hotel and that date and that time so that it would be picked up so that the director would go there to be murdered.
Yeah.
So at any rate, he checks in next door. He hears yelling and screaming and a fight. A person is pushed up against the somewhat opaque glass that separates the two balconies. He thinks it's the woman who's being murdered. He ends up finding out that it is not. He sees the woman. He pieces together that, in fact, it's the opposite. We get a vision of Robert Duvall being suffocated by a clear shower curtain in that hotel room. And then there's a phone conversation. He was called on his phone. How did you get this number? Nobody has his phone number.
Yeah.
Right? How did you get this number? And I believe it's Mr. Stett, Harrison Ford, from the company. And he says, we're listening to you. We know that you know, and we want you to know that we're listening to you. We're listening to everything that you say. And then he gives them evidence that they, in fact, have been listening in his apartment. And so his absolute sanctuary of secrecy and privacy has been penetrated all the way down. And this is this very interesting moment in the film where he tears his apartment entirely to shreds, rips out the walls, takes everything apart. He's an expert in surveillance. He should be able to find the bug, but he doesn't. And exacerbatingly, amongst the ruins of his apartment, he begins to play the saxophone. I think a clear visual reference to the fact that the bug is actually in the saxophone. I don't know if you picked that up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll abide by that.
I think so anyway. That's my read of that element. So, I mean, let's talk about the Taxi Driver a little bit and move a little bit further in. And before we do, you mentioned, this is exactly right, that when the corporatization of Hollywood takes place and multinational corporations start buying it out, and movie theaters, these classic movie theaters, become mere entities in a portfolio, that it opens up this huge creative space and void. Gone is the middle management that often dictated stories and genre of the classic Hollywood era. And there's this massive void, and the shareholders are basically like, oh yeah, you guys know how to make movies? Go ahead and do it. And it opens up this huge space for the movie brats, almost entirely male and entirely white, to come in and fill the void. So Peter Bogdanovich, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Robert Altman, right? These are all members of the kind of movie brat generation in the 1970s, and they take the industry by storm. Movies like The Godfather and Conversation by Coppola, The Last Picture Show by Bogdanovich, Mean Streets sets it off for Scorsese, and through the 1970s. All of these movie brats, to go to the end of the story, before we come back into Taxi Driver, to go to the last chapter of the movie brat and American Renaissance, there are spectacular failures in the 1980s. And the movie brats are in some ways destroyed by their own personal excess, because drugs was a huge part of this. Mm-hmm. But their excesses in terms of the budgets of their films. You look at another movie brat, Michael Cimino, who directed Deer Hunter and won Best Picture with that movie, and then goes on to make Heaven's Gate, which lost tens and hundreds of millions of dollars for Paramount. There were these huge catastrophes in the 1980s, right? One Through the Heart, Francis Ford Coppola's big failure with Terry Garr, him building up American Zoetrope. He wanted to build a studio in San Francisco that would rival Southern California studios, and that, under the weight of that, just crushes him, right? Interestingly enough, though, Scorsese survived better than most.
Yeah.
Scorsese was kind of bankrupt, and he was struggling in the early 80s, but he quickly got out of it. And the way he quickly got out of it, it's really interesting. He went from the outside, and a rebel on the outside, if you will, a movie brat who was part of this renaissance, to becoming fully on the inside, like the most, one of the of our contemporary American film world.
Yes, Spielberg.
He is one of the central pillars of the movie universe. I mean, he makes movies like Hugo. It's just like a kids movie about Georges Méliès, the French director, set in a train station, and he's become so mainstream. But he went from counterculture to mainstream over his career, and I think that certainly helped him. How do you read Taxi Driver?
Well, I think it's Vietnam vet, someone who, cannot exist or has a tough time existing within social circles that most people take for granted.
Yeah.
And you see that in those meetings with the crew at the cafeteria.
Yes.
With the wizard.
Yes. The wizard.
Peter.
Yeah, Peter Boyle.
Peter Boyle, another excellent 70s.
That conversation he has with Peter Boyle, Robert De Niro, outside of the diner, where a guy meets another guy. That was all improvised by Peter. That was not in the script. That was just Scorsese.
That was one of the stupidest things I've ever heard.
yeah, exactly. I don't know. That's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, and he's seeking connection, but he doesn't know how.
Yeah. He
can't read things. I think there's that, that we talked a bit about sort of the racial antagonisms, but then there's, on the one hand, for him, those porno theaters are just regular movies. That's where he takes the date. Like, of course, we're all the couples are seeing this.
Yeah. He tries to pick up the concession girl at the
and
porno
the
movie
concession
theater.
girl, and so there's these weird kind of, consumption of porn on that level, and then at the same time he's trying to save, what's her name?
Jodie Foster.
Jodie Foster's character.
Yeah.
And so and then
Iris,
and then of course when she says, well, that's not the case. I don't need to be saved.
Yeah.
You're just like them.
Yeah.
In the same way when he gets rejected,
good
you're
point.
just like them. So I think Taxi Driver resonates because that is sort of our contemporary neo-misogyny of sort of what's the incel.
Yeah. Incel.
Right. And sort of this, like the Proud Boy.
Yeah.
Like this backlash against women, against the Me Too movement. Almost, when you watch Taxi Driver, it's like, wow, this is, it's always been there, but this
it
seems
leads to it potentially.
Yeah,
and I think that there's some differences, and I think the difference also comes out in the Joker, which we're going to talk about next week. But here's a really interesting question that I struggle with regards to Taxi Driver. What's the nature of Travis Bickle's moral compass? Because you said something about, yes, he's socially awkward, right? And he doesn't, the translated cues of our symbolic cultural world do not resonate with him, and he doesn't really know how to operate in this world. But what's the nature of his moral compass? Because on the one hand, I think this cuts both ways. On the one hand, there's a vision of this film in which the moral compass is everything, to so to speak. That he lives in an immoral world, and that his frustrations are directly tied to the fact that he wants there to be right and wrong, but there's not.
Yes.
And that, in fact, this is the redeemable element of the end of the film. He, instead of shooting Palantine, the guy running for president, and becoming an assassin, in fact, this movie actually encourages assassinations to take place. The Ronald Reagan assassination directly.
He spins around and takes out.
Yeah, he goes to this terrible house of sexually exploiting these young women, and he blows all of these guys away, and he becomes a kind of hero, anti-hero, if you will, or whatever. I mean, you read about him in the papers. He's a regular guy again, and then
which is very 70s vigilante,
totally
Death Wish,
right. And Sybil Shepherd, who rejects him, the beautiful woman who rejects him, she wants to say something at the end. She's like, "Look, Travis, and she doesn't know what to say. And he just puts down the fare, and she doesn't pay. She says, "What do I owe you?" And he puts down the thing, and he looks at her and he says, "So long." Right? He's kind of won.
Yeah.
He has been validated in that film and in that city and in that society. Okay? But on the other side of the coin, quite obviously, there's this visceral racism that comes out. There is this weird paranoia and this spiraling toward violence. There is this message to Iris, "You're just one of them," which I think leads to a kind of inceldom, like psychological worldview. Yeah. Because incels, the way I read incels today, and this particular kind of moment we're in, is that the hatred of women and misogyny, and there's a celebration of violence against women, and the hatred against women is very visceral and genuine and direct for the most part. And that's what I think makes it different than Joaquin Phoenix's Joker character in The Joker, or even Travis Bickle's character in Taxi Driver. He does not, with Sybil Shepherd's character, who's now, her name escapes me, I want to say Lois, but I don't think it's Lois. I'm not sure if it's Betty, but whatever her name is, Sybil Shepherd, who works for the Palantine campaign, right? He doesn't ever show a kind of, maybe he does actually. This is a question more than anything else. I'm digging through this as I think about it. Betsy is her name, the campaign volunteer. Are there moments in which a kind of visceral explosion of violence against her becomes obvious and apparent? It is certainly the case that as she is spurned by him, he goes into the campaign office And he's like, you're just like the rest of them. That's what he says to her first, before he says it to Iris. Like, you're just like the rest of them. You're going to die like the rest of them. And he's yelling and he's screaming and he's clearly violent. And there's a sense, I think, you read of a violence toward him, but immediately the other guy gets involved. And then, and
Albert Brooks.
Albert Brooks, yeah. Who's in that road movie from the 80s. So yeah, I mean...
Well, and then it goes to Iris. So here, I don't know if you're heading in this direction. Iris then is, in his moral code universe, he needs to, and this is where that 50s or 70s masculinity thing, he needs to save her because that means he's saving sort of the women and children that need to be dependent.
Yeah.
And so if he can save
Rescuing
Iris,
the princess in the castle,
then that will help anchor him in this moral code.
Yeah.
He could not save Betsy.
Yep.
And Betsy was smarter, more sophisticated, and he couldn't keep up. But with Iris, here's someone that I can find meaning through saving her, which at the end, that's sort of literally in blood. Like, to me, it's like there's a settler colonial component to this, right? You're saving the women on the frontier in the cabin from the savages on the frontier, and that is one of the formations of like an American identity, right? And
it's
American
the formations
patriarchy
of American cinema.
Yeah.
Birth of a Nation. There is a frontier sequence of Boarding Up the House and Birth of a Nation. I mean, it goes all the way back to the origins of American cinema, this idea. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that there are clearly resonances of male violence upon those females who, this is, I think, part of the savior complex, right? Is that those women who do not want to be saved, or regard you as some kind of awkward and creepy figure who, then they immediately then see you as part of the whole societal complex that has misunderstood them and their desire for a moral compass, then they become just like that, and they become this sort of violence against them is sanctioned in that regard. Although Travis Bickle and Taxi Driver, it doesn't really get there. It doesn't get there at all. I mean, his violence and rage is really, for the foremost, directed at men, right? In fact, there's an interesting moment when Scorsese has his cameo, right? And he jumps in the back of the car, and this is at the triggering of his like development of a kind of violence, enacting violence on Palantine first becomes his first target. The Scorsese character in the back seat, it's about his wife. That's my, whose wife is up there? That's my wife who's up there, right? Yeah. And he says these like brutally terrible things, and I could kill them both, right? And that's the moment I think that sparks Travis Bickle. Very shortly thereafter, he buys all the guns.
So you think it's almost like a weird mentor?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And in a sense, like, so why kill Palantine? Because Betsy spurned him. So it's like he can't enact the violence against her. He's directing it toward like some of the nearest male figures in her universe, right? The man that she works for, right? And that's an interesting displacement that does not, in my opinion, in any way absolve Travis Bickle from these potentialities of violence against women. In fact, it very much tethers them together, I think.
It's a patriarchal code. You go after the men.
Yes, exactly.
Right? You go after the men who ostensibly control the women.
Yeah, exactly. We've done so much already. I don't know if we have enough time to do The Shining, but The Shining I see is a bookend to this that, at the 1970s, because The Shining comes out in 1980. It is misidentified as a 1980s film. It's a 1970s film through and through. And it fits within this complex. It just does so within now the traditional family man, the nucleus of the family, right? The father with the son and the wife, as opposed to the lonely Vietnam veteran taxi driver, or as opposed to the loner professional Mr. Call. Jack Torrance of The Shining is a different identity, same horrors, same tensions, same traumas, same patriarchal and misogynistic lenses of American cinema. And I think we need to tie that in with the Joker. What do you think, Dr. Dan?
I think that's a good idea.
So we've covered some ground today, I think. And I want to insinuate that we have to excavate these American texts for meaning, and we have to think broadly about the way in which they're situated within culture, within our socioeconomic world, within the identity constructions that society and culture, that is a crucial part of society and culture. And 1970s, so much happening there. So much happening. I think we just scratched the surface, but at least we're speaking directly to some important topics at hand. With that in mind, next week we're going to cover the new Joker movie that is out in the movie theaters, starring Joaquin Phoenix. We're going to talk a little bit about comic book and super action hero movies in general. But I think we're going to begin with The Shining, and we'll fit it in, and we'll make some bridges. Okay? Until next time, this is Dr. J and Dr. Dan here. Thank you all, and so long.